Hello, good evening. So, I think we have a few minutes, like a very few minutes delayed. Lovely to see everyone. Very warmest welcome in the Studiensaal of the Kupferstich-Kabinett of the Staatliche Kunstsammlung in Dresden. I have the pleasure and the honor to welcome you on behalf of the Kunstsammlung in Dresden. My name is Doreen Mende. I'm the head of the research department here. And with a great pleasure, we work together tonight with the Kupferstich-Kabinett, where we are holding the annual Lisa and Heinrich Arnhold lecture in 2025. It's a great honor to welcome Professor Abhishek Kaicker, who we've invited to give the annual lecture tonight in a very wonderful collaboration with the American Academy in Berlin. The Lisa and Heinrich Arnhold, I will speak a short introduction because it's very important that we cherish these cooperations these days, and also to introduce a little bit into the format of the Lisa and Heinrich Arnhold lecture. The Lisa and Heinrich Arnhold lecture is a lecture series in Dresden that was initiated by the American Academy in Berlin together with Henry Arnhold, the son of Lisa and Heinrich, in the year of 2001 already. Why in Dresden? Dresden has been the home of the Arnhold family for generations. They were great supporters of the arts, of science, and particularly also of young researchers. They supported them really passionately, till the manifestation of the Hitler-fascist Germany around 1933. At the Arnhold house on Tiergartenstraße in Dresden, the family would regularly invite avant-garde scholars and artists like Wassily Kandinsky or Albert Einstein to give talks, to host informal conversations, for sharing and testing ideas, and to meet friends in an intimate, semi-public format. The Lisa and Heinrich Arnhold lectures here in Dresden connects to this culture of gathering around research in the legacy of intellectual, social, informal, and mutual exchange. It was violently interrupted around 1935 when the fascist administrators of the Nazi regime executed the so-called Aryanisierung on the Arnhold business and pressured the family to leave Germany. We are witnessing today in real time on the 21st century erection of a state-orchestrated authoritarianism of white supremacy in the US. There are so many executive orders that have been issued in the last 3 months pressuring and destroying the freedom of art and research in museums and academia in the US. Most recently, the Smithsonian Institute was pressured to comply to the policy and the federal law of the new US government, which is basically really disenabling a freedom of research and of art. And also maybe just, it was in the Tagesschau even a few days ago that reported that US state archives systematically delete data, images, and documents on Black binary transgender lives in their archives. And students are deported, students' fellowships are defunded, and scholars leave the country. This is what has been going through the media and also has arrived here. So we are thinking of our colleagues and friends in the US, in academia and in the museum, across the US in these deeply challenging times. And we offer our support, our alliances, our friendship, and network. Also in this spirit, I'm really very grateful to have the privilege for the cooperation with the American Academy in Berlin. It is a time of an unconditional clarity to defend the right of freedom of research, which means to maintain a plurality of voices and images in archives and collections as well as in academia, to foster epistemic excellence through a diversity of methods, terminologies, and positions, to acknowledge the long degrees of a politics of difference as rich histories of knowledge, or rather also as planetary systems of knowledge, as diverse, ambivalent, complex, and different as life and humans are. We are immensely grateful that since 2021, the SKD hosts the annual lecture of the Arnhold, Lisa and Heinrich Arnhold lecture in the Continuous Friendship with the American Academy in Berlin. For me personally, it is the third time to welcome you in Dresden. Thank you so much for coming over today, dear Abhishek, but also your fellow researchers here who have arrived, Agnes Müller, Christian Andersen, and Madeleine Cassat. Throughout these years, it has been a profound pleasure and really inspiration to meet the fellows of the American Academy. For example, I just remember a few, like from the last years, Ariela Isha Soule, Johannes von Molke, Adam Schatz, Adam Weinberg, who gave the lecture last year, Lee Rayford, a brilliant, wonderful colleague also with whom we had really good conversations. A few weeks ago, Abhishek Kaicker, who has been here in Dresden a day to meet our colleagues, Marion Heisterberg and Petra Kuhlmann-Hodek, to study the Indian miniature painting of the Mughal Empire. It was a very inspiring and a very great day. Thank you so much, really, dear colleagues, also for arranging the time and making it possible that we had this study day. The email announcement of the 3 views on Asia and the Dresden Kunstkammer or collections led already to a few questions in response that I will use a little bit to now to announce Abhishek's talk by colleagues who ask for the clarification of what is meant with the construction of history through art and collecting practices. Why 3 views? In the European royal context, the notion of empire entails a history of power relations, of imperialism, competition between imperial powers, representation, and global trade relations that range from diplomacy to colonialism. The historian Martin Jay famously coined the term empires of vision to describe the entanglement of imperial power with aesthetics, which the cultural theorist Sarat Maharaj analyzed regarding the dominance of images in creating our visions of the world as a retinal regime. August the Strong is a good example to study the elements of an empire of vision in Martin Jay's understanding and to learn to see the variety of imperial desires to collect the world. Certainly the concept of Kunstkammer as a world en miniature, the world in a microcosm, provided the conditions also for artists to develop an artistic virtuosity for constructing a visual language, for imagining the world through the lens of an electorate of the Holy Roman Empire. There is no judgment implicated here, rather the acknowledgement of such imperial world-making that includes beauty and virtuosity as much as violence and injustice of European colonial global networks. Surely it contains a demanding, difficult, mesmerizing, and necessary diversity of ideas, of histories, of knowledge. 3 views on Asia, this is the title of the talk by Abhishek Kaicker, will allow us to think with the historian Abhishek Kaicker and to learn about an Asian or Indian situated history of world-making through images, a world imagining, a world imaging. It allows to engage with art, the practice of miniature painting, and the art of collecting in relation to their capacities to the construction of history, which is the very history that we study today and we also sometimes struggle with. Yet, what does this mean in the pre-colonial context of the Mughal Empire? That means before colonial imperial powers changed language, economics, politics, law, education, and social structures in Asia. So I'm really looking forward to your talk, Abhishek. It's been really a pleasure already to be in conversation. And it will be really important for us also to hear you, to also sharpen our understanding, how we look at history, how do we understand how history is constructed through images. And before I will speak your short biographical note, I would like to ask Johanna Gallop, please, to say a few words.
ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome also from me. My name is Johanna Galup. I am the program manager at the American Academy in Berlin. And this morning we left on the 11 o'clock train and came with Abhishek and fellows from the American Academy to visit your lovely city. I just want to say two very quick things. One is a warm invitation to you all from Dresden to come and visit us in Berlin at the American Academy. The Academy is a non-profit center for advanced studies in the humanities and arts, and we bring American scholars, artists, musicians, and journalists to Berlin and host them at the beautiful villa we have in the district of Berlin-Wannsee. And we are connected to the Dresden State Art Collections by the family of Arnhold. And the American Academy is also called the Hans Arnhold Center. And every semester we house 12 to 13 scholars and create a rich cultural program of talks, readings, literary evenings, music, and other events. And our events are always free in English, and you will find us in Berlin-Wannsee, and I would love to welcome you to our house if you would like to visit us. We have 2 to 3 events every week. And the second thing that I wanted to do tonight is say thank you for your hospitality. Many thanks to Dorian Mende, to Professor Ackermann, who of course is at the helm of the institution when we started our cooperation 6 lectures ago. I would also like to thank the colleagues from the Kupferstich-Kabinett and Anneliese for welcoming us so warmly in Dresden. And I wish you a very beautiful evening at last. Thank you to Abhishek for agreeing to come to Dresden for this talk. If you would like to have more information, please come find me after the talk, and hope to see you in Berlin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Also, thank you really for continuing the collaboration and for this really brilliant exchange, really uncomplicated and in a very collegial way. And I second the thanks to my colleagues, the Kupferstich-Kabinett, Anneliese Reit, and all the invisible labor that also really is necessary in order to realize such an evening. So now let me introduce Abhishek. Before we are going to listen to Abhishek's talk, that by the way will be in English, and we have prepared a translation in German that will be projected on that monitor. And then also, what else was I supposed to say, Anneliese? Yes. This is also possible, absolutely. And as you can see, we are recording tonight. It's not live streamed, but we would like to edit the recording into a contribution for the video channel of SKD. If you do not like to be pictured there, then let us know. So Abhishek Kaicker is the Nina Maria Gorison Fellow in History of the spring term 2025 at the American Academy in Berlin. And I read somewhere Nina Maria Gorison is also a relative of the Arnhold family. Abhishek is Associate Professor of History at the University of California in Berkeley. He holds a PhD in History from Columbia University with a specialization on the Persianate South Asia. This is around 1200 till 1900, particularly the history also of the Mughal Empire. His research focuses on intellectual history and the history of concepts, early modern global history, politics and the city, and the continuities between the pre-colonial and the post-colonial South Asia. Abhishek is the author of the book The King and the People, Sovereignty and Popular Politics in Mughal Delhi from 2020, came out with Oxford University Press, which offers the first comprehensive account of the relationships between the ruling authority and urban subjects in Mughal Delhi. So this is not the first fellowship that Abhishek has been awarded. He also had fellowships at the Harvard University and the Columbia University, and it's a great pleasure to welcome him tonight here at Dresden Kunstsammlung. Please join me in welcoming Abhishek. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. And I'm moved by your statement of support in these dark times. So I would like to begin with a note of gratitude that is not unmixed with trepidation. As I said, I am, of course, profoundly thankful to both the American Academy in Berlin and the SKD in Dresden for the opportunity to speak here tonight in this wonderful setting. The American Academy has served as a fecund intellectual home for the past several months, and I am truly obliged to Joanna Gallup and Linda Rossi, who's not here, for enabling this visit, among others. I'm also deeply grateful for the invitation to the SKD tonight, and thank Doreen Mender for this opportunity and Annalisa Reith for making it happen. My remarks today derive substantially from what I've had the good fortune to learn directly about the items in this collection from Petra Kuhlmann-Hodig and Marian Heisterberg. To them, I express my deepest gratitude. I think we're not ready for this yet. First I have to express my sense of trepidation. So to join you in the space of the lineal descendant of the electoral Kunstkammer is to have the personal sense of connection to the depth of a rich historical past in this historical place. My fear, of course, is caused by my acute awareness that as an historian, I'm hardly equipped to say anything particularly interesting about the materials that art historians have treated with a sophistication and an erudition that I cannot hope to match. With this somewhat more than pro forma disclaimer of inadequacy, it remains my hope that as a historian of early modern South Asia, I will be able to reflect on the contexts in which some of the works that we will look at today in Dresden were produced. I'm, of course, on far less sure a footing in hoping to interpret how they may have been received or understood in Europe and in Dresden, but I hope you will indulge my admittedly unfounded speculations on this subject nonetheless. Okay. So what I would like to do today is to discuss three items that entered the Dresden Kunstkammer by the early 18th century and say something about what might become visible, occluded, or imagined through their views of Asia's presents and pasts. And I speak of Asia even though my focus will be on India because I will focus on 3 volumes of portraits, 2 of which were prepared in India, and 1 which is rather more ambiguous in origin. And what I shall not try to do is to stitch these items together into an argument about historical change over time, which is what historians do. Instead, my objective is to consider what vision of Indian history may have animated these works and how they might have been received or reinterpreted in Europe. Okay? So, come back to that in a second. The first question we must consider is why these items are here at all. And the answer should be obvious. These items, by the way, are on the table right here, and we'll hopefully have the chance to take a look at them. So the question is why they're here at all, and the answer should be obvious. These books are before us today because of a curiosity about far-off lands across 17th century Europe. In writing of early modern European apprehensions of India, the historian Sanjay Subramaniam has recently suggested that, and I'm quoting, different forms of knowledge and modes of knowledge production existed, and sometimes they and their adherents struggled bitterly with one another. By the early 18th century, he goes on to say, several seemingly stable conventions regarding the representation of India in Europe had been established. The 2 most important spheres of Indian life that were represented by the early 18th century were undoubtedly those that may be termed politics and religion. So in this broad context, our concern today will be limited to the politics side of European interests. There's a rich history of interest in Indian religions, but we will not be touching on that today. My approach here has been fundamentally shaped by the truly exemplary scholarship of my Columbia University colleague, Marta Beccarini, much of whose dissertation research was in fact conducted on the materials from this collection. In her important dissertation, Beccarini has argued that, and I'm quoting, the extent and type of knowledge that Europeans were able to gather through the enterprises of collecting were also not entirely dictated by their concerns and predetermined programs, but also, and not unimportantly, by contingencies related to a variety of Indian realities. In this sense, it is impossible to conceive of the emergence and the development of a system of knowledge, what I've called European curiosity about India, in early modern Europe as a linear, consistent process regulated by European methods and responding to European concerns alone. So this is a foundational point for me. Beccarini further points out, and I'm quoting, early modern collecting culture, of which this is an instance, was born of a variety of concerns and agendas intersecting the realms of politics, religion, art, philosophy, and science. And portraits were of central importance in this culture. Beccarini observes that this period saw the rise of images done ad vivum, from life, and quoting Dana Leibsohn, quote, the increased emphasis on optical authority served as a way to register, if not also control, the exponential growth of new experiences and encounters with foreign peoples and objects. To this, I would simply add that even more fundamentally, portraits are portraits only because we recognize something of ourselves in them. And we will return to this question of recognition and self-recognition in different ways throughout our discussion. What we shall see, therefore, are objects with very different intellectual histories that come to occupy varying places within the structure of European curiosity about Asia's past. And what we shall gesture towards today is the complex interplay of incomprehension, awareness, reinterpretation, and disengagement that arose when Europeans encountered works such as the ones that we shall look at today. Okay. So the first object that we shall turn to today is an album held under the shelf mark CA113 and given the title Portraits of Rulers. In some ways, this is an unprepossessing work whose chief attraction is perhaps its unusual depiction of two Indian queens, Rani Prabhavati and Razia Sultana. And the book contains portraits of, in total, 124 Hindu kings and 55 Muslim rulers. I'll give you a couple of examples. 5, 6, there we go. The catalog points out the existence of two similar works, one held at the Victoria and Albert Museum and the other at the Bodleian Library. The first of these contains 179 portraits, the other 178, of which 2 are missing. So while I've not had the chance to compare all of these 3 volumes, the congruence of the total number of portraits suggests that what we are seeing before us is a standardized representation, something that was commonly done, perhaps. But what is it a representation of? The straightforward answer, namely that this is a series of Indian rulers, is actually quite unsatisfactory, because many of the rulers depicted are not historical personages, as is evident from their lack of identification in the catalogue. A further puzzle is posed by the fact that the figures themselves are extremely generic and barely painted, quite unlike other more lavish collections of portraits to which we shall soon turn. If the paintings seem almost perfunctory, why then were they even created? One answer to this question might begin with the acknowledgement that the primary purpose of these paintings is not to represent individual rulers, but perhaps a broader vision of the history of India as such. This vision of deep history, as we might call it, was one that had begun to be articulated in the 17th century. One instance of this is a work attributed to the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan, who reigned in the mid-17th century, his secretary Chandraban Brahman, a figure recently studied in some depth by the historian Rajiv Kindra. Now, this work, entitled A History of the Rulers of Delhi in Persian, begins with an account of the era of darkness, the epoch of decline and strife symbolized by the rule of the goddess Kali, and inaugurated by the death of the human incarnation of the god Krishna following the events of the epic internecine war of the Mahabharata. So it should be evident that this is also a Hindu conception of the past. For this author who is writing for the Mughal court in the mid-17th century, the total number of the years of this era is apparently 432,000, and something like 5,028 years have elapsed until his own day. So we still have a long way down. The account of kings that he assembles is from, quote, Indian books and other volumes of history, of which he names only one, namely a fairly recent collation of somebody called Nizamuddin Ahmad, who had been given the task of producing the Stages of Akbar, a vast history commissioned at the court of the third Mughal emperor of the same name. And so this author compiles, quote, the names of the various rajas and great khans who in this interval have on the throne of Delhi planted the flags of kingship and the standards of rule. In total, they are 174, which should be a familiar number. Of that group of the rajas, there have been 121 bodies who have reigned, and the entirety of their reign has been 4,134 years and 3 months, and the sultans have been 53 bodies, and they have reigned 892 years and 2 months, and he goes on. Okay, so the work goes on in a way that accords with this volume of portraits. So first we learn that the first ruler of the Kali Yuga was Raja Yudhishthir. He had 3 sons, and his descendants reigned for 1,161.5 years. Our author says that he was the greatest of kings, and of him it is said that he fed 60,000 persons at his table daily, and he ruled personally for 33 years and 8 months and 25 days. And he was succeeded by Raja Parikhat or Parikshit, and he ruled for 61 years, and his successor was Raja Janmaji, as it appears in the text, and he ruled for 84 years and 5 months and 18 days. And it is in this reign that the book, the Kitab of the Mahabharata, which is the account of the Pandus of Ved Vyas, that is Ved Vyas, was written. And the entire book has 100,000 shlokas. Okay, so in other words, what we are seeing is that this volume seems to agree, at least in the beginning that I've been able to inspect, with the genealogy of rulers produced by an officer at the court of Shah Jahan. What needs to be emphasized, however, that the textual genealogy that I brought for you is a polemical genealogy because it draws on mythical Hindu conceptions of time that are at odds with the Islamic conception of the origins of the world. Now, to be sure, some intellectuals try to reconcile the incommensurate chronologies of a world that was created by God and began with Adam, and a world of cyclical time produced by the churning of the ocean by demons and demigods, which is the sort of Hindu version. An important instance of this attempt at reconciliation was proposed by the Deccani historian Muhammad Qasim Firishta, as recently studied by Manan Asif. But this was not a universally accepted solution. And by way of counterexample, we might point to other polemical disputations, such as an incident in the late 18th century in which the historian Khairullah al-Abadi asserted the validity of the Islamic conception of cosmogony, even as he accepted some of the premises of Hindu views of the same. Khairullah, interestingly, notably proposed that the children of Adam had been at war with Raja Parikshit and conquered him before the Great Deluge. After this, Noah's son Ham had sons named Hind and Sindh, who went on to found India. Okay. So, in light of this complex conversation between different conceptions of time and the origins of the world and their rulers, an album such as this one can be read as an assertion of one view of Indian history, one that locates it firmly in the Mahabharata epic, and one that emphasizes the recency of the Mughals' arrival on the scene. At the same time, and this is a particularly significant feature, there is no visual break that marks the eruption of Muslim rule in India. This is surprising. For a history that asserts the depth of Hindu kingship in India, one might imagine some momentous or even slight indication of the transformations wrought by the founding of the Delhi Sultanate, which inaugurates Muslim rule in India in the year 1206. Instead, there's a kind of seamless flow from mythical Hindu rulers to real Hindu and Muslim ones. And so, by way of example, I present to you two instances. One, the turbans on the heads of these Hindu rulers are of the generic Mughal Rajput style. And it is the same style to which Akbar and Jahangir, the Mughal rulers, will revert at the end of the work. In other words, the turbans and the patterns that ancient and non-existent Hindu rulers are dressed in happens to be exactly the same fashion as the court of Jahangir and Akbar in the 17th century. So, having said that, it's not at all clear to me that this deep history of the meanings of this particular volume would have been either apparent or of profound interest to viewers in Dresden. But I think that other kinds of work certainly demanded other kinds of engagements. And so with that, let us come to our second object, which is also present here, the album of portraits held under the shelf mark CA112, which, as the catalog establishes, was produced no earlier than 1688 and entered the hands of a German-speaking owner by 1689. Beccarini hypothesizes, convincingly in my opinion, that the album's artists had a small number of tracings of Mughal rulers at hand and a larger number of images of local elites, and this indicates the predominance of peninsular Indian figures in these albums. What Beccarini persuasively demonstrates is that, and so, for instance, you see a Mughal figure on the left and a peninsular Deccan figure on the right. What Beccarini persuasively demonstrates is that a Dutch presence at the Golconda court in peninsular India in the mid-17th century provided access to a royal workshop of portraitists whose members may then have produced a series of portrait albums of varying quality for the export market. Perhaps through the hands of a single individual, these albums entered collections in Amsterdam, a city which at this time had no fewer than 70 collections of art and a renowned public market for art. Okay. Drawing on the work of the sociologist Igor Kopytov, Beccarini shows that these albums are an example of what she calls restricted commoditization. They are standardized, in a sense, as commodities, but they're perceived as exclusive items because of their rarity and their novelty. Beccarini goes on to offer a fascinating account of how such portrait books would have been read along historical or other texts from India by those who saw them, which included men such as John Locke and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. The question that arises before historians of South Asia, however, is why these portrait books are arranged in the order that they bear. And despite significant variance in the portraits included, they do bear the same general order as Beccarini establishes by comparison of another similar work at hand, that is the Witsen album in Amsterdam. So what is significant about this album is that unlike the previous work, it does not present a single unilinear chronology. If you were to flip through this book as a knowledgeable observer in its time, you would be led from a portrait of the third Mughal emperor, yellow background, to the sixth, Aurangzeb. But this was not just a dynastic history. The portraits also include Aurangzeb's brothers, all of whom died at that prince's hand as he ascended the throne. Okay. Then follow spiritual preceptors, Rajput warriors, and second-rung generals of the Mughals, with a frictionless transition back to the time of Sultan Muhammad Quli Qutb Shah, died 1612, and then subsequent Deccan rulers and political elites. It is only the last four paintings of this album that whisk us away from India to Iran and the three recent rulers of that place. So, to the untrained eye of someone who is not an art historian, a striking feature of such courtly portraiture is their general indistinction. I make this statement with some reserve. Although the Emperor Jahangir was profoundly concerned with the veracity of the portraits he commissioned, as Yael Rice has recently shown, and that portraits represented ideal types, as she further argues, this album does not seem to make distinct or individualized qualitative statements about its subjects. The creator of this album was certainly aware of this problem, which might be manifest even more sharply to a foreign viewer because of the somewhat unusual labeling of every single figure. And you can see that there's a label that names the person who is placed here. This act, to me, seems to indicate, on the one hand, that despite their indistinction, these are not generic figures. They refer to specific individuals who are important to the recent history and politics of North and South India. On the other hand, this also indicates that this album is meant for viewers who are not expected to recognize every individual by sight, even if some faces are obviously traced from imperial portraits. Yet more striking is the sense of movement in this volume and others like it. We sense we are being led from North India, Zone 1, to South India, Zone 2, with a termination in Iran, Zone 3. Okay? And I just want to show you how the portraits work. So first, a series of portraits of individuals in North India, then a series in South India, and then the final four in Iran. So the history in this album is resolutely that of the 17th century political order. Unlike other such albums, for instance, I should add, by the way, the dynastic founder Babur from the 16th century is simply absent from depictions here. And I think it is here that the sense of the indistinction of figures becomes powerful, because it implies that there's no fundamental difference between the Mughal order and the Deccan political order. It is true, of course, that Akbar and Jahangir, the Mughal emperors, are distinctive in their appearance, and that the Mughals after Shah Jahan conform to a standard appearance of Sunni Hanafi piety. It is also true that the rulers of the Deccan appear in distinct garb and facial hair. So you see those on the right. While the Mughals wear their own standard uniform of diaphanous overskirts, which you will sort of see over here. But more broadly, what the album implies is that there is a kind of indistinction in the political culture and the organization of the Deccan Sultanates and the Mughal Empire. This is all the more intriguing because by 1689, when this manuscript arrived in the hands of its German-speaking owner, all of these Deccan principalities and the rulers who were depicted in them had been violently extinguished by the Emperor Aurangzeb in a war of conquest. To put all of these individuals, some of whom were responsible for the death of others, on a literal level playing field without offering any kind of narrative is also to make a kind of claim about history and politics. We are reminded of the historian Roy Fischel's claim that the sultanates of the Deccan, the sultanates in Zone 2 that we had seen, which were in the process of becoming defunct during the composition of this album, had rejected through a number of means the ideology of universal sovereignty and exclusive imperial dominance that the Mughals had espoused. So this historical and political claim, I suspect, would not also have been immediately obvious to European viewers. Yet one thing we know for sure is that European viewers were certainly reading political meaning in these albums. What they were looking for were precisely those dramatic spectacles of universal sovereignty, or by another name, Oriental despotism, that might have been rejected by the Deccan composers of these kinds of albums. This is certainly how we might see the famed paintings of the mid-17th century Dutch artist Willem Schellings. So if you will permit me to now go away from Dresden, we'll go away from Dresden for a bit and look at some of his works, which appreciatively invoke Mughal portraits, rearranging and juxtaposing them in ways that read this history as a political drama with lessons for European princes. I won't say too much about this painting by Schellings, which has been admirably discussed by Sanjay Subramaniam in his book Courtly Encounters. Following Subramaniam, I understand Schellings, who has never been to India, to be taking the portraits of Mughal princes that he has seen and staging them in the fratricidal contest of power that would be won by Aurangzeb. And this was a kind of major moment, the victory of Aurangzeb by the killing of his brothers and the arresting of his father and the coming to power, which is not a history that is at all visible in the volume that we have just looked at, was very much a history that Europeans were aware of and fascinated by. And these are battles for sovereignty in a way that would make perfect sense to a European viewer. The four sons of Shah Jahan, who battle each other in this image, do so on vehicles that are made out of composite human figures. Now, such figures evoke not just Mughal composite animal portraits, and not just the human-like assemblages of the fruits of Archimboldo, but perhaps most proximately the cover of Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, which would have been available on the continent in French as early as 1652. Notice also that the drama that Schelling paints for us is staged for an indeterminate number of audiences. On the back of the stage, we see Shah Jahan watching his four sons. Above him, in a cloud, his ancestors Akbar and Jahangir in apotheosis, the people of the world making for rowdy spectators in the galleries, and not least, us gazing on the stage from a prime position in the theater that mirrors Shah Jahan's place. So we might, of course, ask if Akbar and Jahangir are in fact watching the spectacle below them, or whether they have truly moved on to higher matters of the kind that will occupy Shah Jahan after his own deposition and eventual death in 1666. Another question is whether we are watching Shah Jahan watch his sons from the opposite side of the stage, or whether the opposite side of the stage merely mirrors us, and we are watching from the perspective of Shah Jahan himself. Whether two audiences, or three, or four, Schelling seems to suggest to us that the contest for sovereignty we see unfolding somewhere else is a story very much about our European selves. And I do say ourselves because of the potential indistinction between the Indian ruler and the European viewer that is implied in this painting. So it is Schelling who actually brings us back to Dresden again, because of his staging of Mughal painting in a Baroque theater plays with the principles of central perspectival scenery, in which the theater stage vanishes at a point that it is directly across from the royal box, which is, I want to remind you, the perspective of this painting. Such a royal box was built in Dresden's new opera house in 1667. Writing about this, observes the historian Dror Warman in a recent work, court stagings, especially arranged for regal celebrations, could lead to expectations of a mirroring relationship between the two focal points inside a theater, one that serves as a mirror for princes to laud the exemplary monarch in the present and in the future. And all of this, of course, was the context for Johannes Melchior Dinglinger's construction of the three-dimensional throne of the great Mughal for the Saxon ruler Augustus the Strong, which is one of the centerpieces of the museum in which we are currently sitting. In making this work, Dinglinger, argues Warman, also created a mirror of Oriental absolutism for Augustus the Strong, whose interest in the Mughals would also have been fed by the paintings in these volumes. Okay. So, to conclude, we have now been led very far away from India and are firmly back in Dresden on European soil. We have seen in this lecture how the two sets of painted works from the Deccan embodied visions of an Indian past and how they might have been interpreted in Europe, or not interpreted, as the case might be. European observers were certainly animated by curiosity and did understand that portraits from over there could be understood in terms of stories from over here, even if some of the particulars might escape them. But images, representations, views, and histories from other parts of the world served also as springboards for European imaginations, imaginations that lofted quite free of the materials from which they were launched. In a characteristically wide-ranging recent essay, Alexander Bevilacqua has shown how at the turn of the late 17th and the early 18th centuries, the royal court in nearby Brandenburg staged festivities that celebrated their minor participation in the African slave trade as a way of producing, quote, a legible ideological and racial distinctiveness for ends that have become unfamiliar today. It served to mark their equality with other rulers, continuity with their predecessors, and superiority over their subjects. And such a framework might apply very well to the kinds of materials that we have seen today. It is in this broad context that we must place the final work under consideration today, to which I can only devote 30 seconds by way of conclusion. And this is the strange album held under the shelf mark CA115, a work which is entitled Japanese Miniature Portraits. What follows is a story in French, which seems to be an account of the arrangements of the upper echelons of the court in Japan from a period that I'm unable to discern, but perhaps around the time of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, 1615. These remarks are accompanied by an astonishing set of portraits that appear done in a European hand. Although the figures they depict are of varying, if not immediately obvious ethnicity, their dress in most instances is very evidently Mughal. So as a glance at the turban immediately indicates, these portraits were made with scrupulous care and attention. Yet what is produced is a kind of pastiche of Indian history, or Asian history, as the case might be, because they're of the indistinction between the place of India and Japan in this particular work. And what it reminds us is that perhaps the great pleasures of the study of history, fundamentally, are the ability not just to learn about others, which seems to be the framework that we think about the European acquisition of knowledge, but to serve merely as a vehicle for fantasies and the pleasures of imagination that place us in totally different contexts. Thank you. Thank you.
Any questions? Okay.
Sorry. Yes.
I'm curious about this collecting and the collectors, and how did they know what to collect? Were there intermediaries? Were they traders? Could you talk a little bit about that flow of information back and forth?
Absolutely. So this is a phenomenon that has been very well studied, but particularly by the work of Beccarini, on whom I rely. And I think what Beccarini shows us is that in the case of these particular volumes, which came to Dresden from Amsterdam, almost certainly from Amsterdam, and they look like other volumes that are also present in Amsterdam in the late 17th century. And she hypothesizes that there was a Dutch trading mission to Amsterdam, a Dutch trading mission from Amsterdam to the Golconda court in the late 17th century, and that these people, the Dutch, acquired a kind of keen interest in these paintings that were already circulating to some degree in Europe and were seen as rarities and prized items. And so some individual Dutch person decided that they would perhaps use these paintings for sale in Europe. And so they were carried back, and they were sort of produced according to a standard type, and several volumes were created, and it might have been a single individual. Now, nobody knows who that individual is, but that individual might have been someone like this figure on the left, who is a Dutch commercial agent in the Deccan in South India called Cornelius van den Bogaard. And he is a person who, there are some remarkable paintings of him that are done obviously in an Indian style, where he's shown wearing his European clothes in the presence of his Indian interlocutors, right, who might be traders. And so, what this painting tells us is that this figure certainly thought that Indian painting was incredibly interesting and valuable, and he took the pains to commission a fairly high-quality version of that work. And I should add that this exists in the context of that kind of painting. And that kind of painting on the other side is a kind of general export painting. So it's currently held at the Victorian Albert Museum. But this is the kind of painting that is designed for export to Europe in a certain kind of way. And we know that it's designed for export to Europe because it combines both an Indian painting with a drawing that looks like a European drawing, but is actually done by an Indian hand. And we know that because there are inscriptions on both these paintings that say, interestingly enough, the work of India. So made in India, right? They say made in India on both of them, on both parts of this painting. with calligraphy added, right? So in the context of this general culture of the export of certain kinds of paintings as high-value items that are carried by European traders, Beccarini surmises that the volumes that you are going to see today, in particular the second volume that I discussed, is a high-quality instance, and this accords perfectly with the research in the catalog, which both came out in the same year, 2017. And so I think independently, we are on fairly safe ground is saying that these Dutch traders are absolutely central to the coming of these valuable albums to European shores.
Can I be heard? Okay. Just to add that in this album, as Abhishek mentioned, there is a note in German saying this book is of very high quality, very valuable, and has the date of one day after of Christmas in 1689. So and we have a very long-lasting tradition of having this type of works in Europe. So you have a very similar style, like in the 113 album. There are similar works in Vienna and Schönbrunn, perhaps done by same kind of workshop. So Marta Beccarini and also Pauline Joyle have researched a lot on this topic.
Thank you so much, Abhishek, for this really brilliant elaboration. I have a clarification question just to also understand really the kind of the geopolitics of the construction of the image. So do I understand correctly that the portraits we saw had been conceived for a European desire, for a European market, that have been traded via the Dutch, and then we do not quite know how it might have arrived in Dresden. Is this something, exactly, is this something that like had been, because I'm asking this also, Julia Weber is here, the director of the Porzellan collection, and Claudia Brink, who is working in the Green World, and that these kind of depictions, what a European desire would like to see, we can find in a few further collections, in a few further contexts. I just try to, maybe you could clarify this, that I got this.
Yeah, I would defer to being corrected by the expert in the room, but I think that's generally a true statement. Now, it should be added that these portraits themselves respond to or are copies of, let's say, Mughal portraits. So, in the center and on the right, I want to show you two examples of very famous Mughal portraits that seem to be produced for restricted audiences in the Mughal Empire, namely rulers and princes themselves, not other people. All three of these portraits, in fact. But it gets complicated because these portraits themselves are based on engagements with European themes and subjects from the early 17th, the late 16th century. So there's I think the scholarship emphasizes that there's a kind of back and forth conversation where Indian artists from time to time engage more immediately with European traditions and sometimes less so. But certainly the case would be that in the albums that are present over here, we are talking about artists who have seen and are aware of paintings like these, but are producing something that is designed purely for export, I would imagine.
I have a follow-up question. Yeah, but maybe we also can go to the table where we have the originals. Mm-hmm. But could you depict a little bit and that we can understand that better, how that might have been discussed in the ateliers in Delhi, or at the court of the artist at the court, or how did that travel? These to understand what could be desired from a European perspective. At the same time, it's been folded back and being decontextualized into a fantasy, as you described, which I found really very important and very compelling. Yeah. But how can we understand like how that had been discussed and really practiced in order to imagine?
Yes, there has been some scholarship on this question, most recently by scholars such as Mika Natif and others. But the fundamental problem is that we don't actually have accounts from Mughal painters. And we have the names of some Mughal painters who are recorded, but these are people who really are the elites in the painting establishment and are closely connected to the royal court. What we don't really have are their words. And what we don't really have, or seem to have, are expressions of their ideas in words. So we have very, very few comments on questions of painting themselves and the way that they're done and how they might be appreciated or even viewed by Mughal observers. And there seems to be, and this is my theory now, so now I'm just going to go out on a limb. My theory is that, and it's not only my theory, I base it on other scholarship, but my theory is that there's a tension in Mughal painting, and the tension in Mughal painting lies between the fact that Mughal painting, that Indians recognize painting to be beautiful and important and worthy of collecting, but that painting itself is a low status and low caste activity. And that at least some important painters of the 18th century belong broadly to low castes, including castes that are conducted, that are involved in the creation of, let's say, furniture or woodworking or wood painting, and that this is an occupation that is seen as lowly. So quite unlike, let's say, the world of 18th century Europe, in which artists are highly regarded and respected in certain kinds of ways. We do not even know the names of most of the artists who make the paintings in the Mughal Empire. They did not feel it necessary, and nobody asked them to put their names on the paintings that they created. So given that very different social context, it's very difficult to say anything concrete about the precise ways in which this might have happened. Art historians who know much more about this than I do, however, have been able to show very nicely precisely when it is that certain stylistic movements or gestures are appropriated in particular works of art in the early 17th century, how there are turns away from them in the late 17th century, and then all kinds of continuing exchanges. Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know whether Claudia, could you say something about
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. And I learned a lot about construction of history in India. That was very intriguing because there was the same question rising in Europe on also the traditional religious convictions were challenged by the encounters with the foreign cultures that dated back so much longer than biblical history. So perhaps my question is, do we know about how encounters with Europeans and European art and imports changed or challenged Indian culture at the time? Is there research on this?
I think that's a very interesting question. I think that the 17th century is a period of reciprocal fascination with Europe. So I think that if on the one hand Europeans are interested in Indian portraits, this is the title of a work by a scholar named Mika Natif. But I do think that there's a kind of serious interest in courtly contexts, at least initially, courtly contexts with the presence of Europeans. So we know extremely well that the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the English are at the Mughal court in the early 17th century, that they are as overwhelmed by the jewels of the Mughal court as I am by the Dresden museum, and they bring works of art that are immediately incorporated into the European, into the Mughal atelier. So, for instance, in the center, you obviously see a painting that is a representation of the Virgin Mary, that is done at a court that is very interested in religious polemics and in trying to understand and reconcile the truth of all religious traditions, in which Christians are also included. And we have accounts of debates, for instance, at the court of the Emperor Jahangir in the nights, these informal gatherings that are staged as contests between different views of religious truth, including views of religious history, where the Quran comes into a kind of sharp contest with the Bible, right? And the Jesuits are asked to defend their views. For instance, what does it mean for the Holy Trinity to exist? How can that possibly be? And so forth. So there are these sharp exchanges that take place at the same time and are connected to these Occidental curiosities, shall we say, right? What I think is even more interesting is that by the 18th century, you see a kind of expansion of this interest beyond the court. And so now what we're looking at is not, the fanciest of paintings, but paintings that I would say even begin to approach the ethnographic in a certain kind of way. And so there is a kind of interest in European figures. I particularly love the painting on the right because it's clearly a work of profound exoticism. Is it really the case, for instance, that Europeans sit on chairs and tables? Is it really the case that they use knives in the way that they do? Is it true that men and women both wear hats and essentially indistinguishable garments? Do they wear shoes at dinner? And so, so there's a kind of exoticism that is very much implicit here. But there's much more could be said about European curiosity, about Indian curiosity, about Europe, which shows up also in other sites and other places, including text and poetry. But that, I think, still requires more systematic research.
But my guess is that the extent, am I here? Yeah. The extent of influence in Europe through the influx of imports from Asia and other parts of the world might have reached further because they changed politics or economics, because of the amount of wares that fled into Europe. And of course, traditional artworks had to compete now with new artworks, and that was followed with reaction, just like the funding of the first porcelain manufactory in Meissen, of course. Mm-hmm. So I guess that the extent of influence was bigger towards Europe.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting historical revision, because of course for a long time we have believed that influence only flows one way, from Europe to Asia. As a counter, but I would just like to add to that simply the fact that there are more Europeans, I think, present in South Asia, even if they're in minuscule numbers, probably than there are South Asians present in Europe in the same period. And so that more people in one place, more export items in the other, leads to questions. Of course, it's also very hard to speak of India. I mean, I've spoken of India loosely in this talk, but really we're speaking of a space called the Mughal Empire that stretches from Kandahar to Chittagong, from Kashmir to the south tip of India, from Afghanistan to Burma, essentially, and has 120 million people in it. So it really is a Europe-sized space in the 17th and the 18th centuries, and it's entirely possible that the levels of communication and the depths of interaction vary enormously across different spaces. Yeah.
Are there still further questions? Comments? I still have a question. Because it made me think of the Edward Said's publication from 1978 of Orientalism. It's a profound analysis how the perspective on Egypt has been constructed through the expedition of Napoleon and the whole fantasy, also to imagine the geography of Egypt to be summarized and fantasized into what he coins Orientalism. It's been a major reference in postcolonial studies. And would you think, would you go so far to think of such a construction in the context of the subcontinent, in the context of Asia, to construct a perspective, to construct a view and an image, a European constructed perspective on Asia or the Indian kind of imaginary?
Yeah.
How would you describe it, or what would terminologies that you would think of?
Yeah. So I think there are two views about this. Edward Said's Orientalism has been obviously absolutely foundational for the way that scholars of South Asia have thought about how the knowledge of South Asia has been constructed in European contexts. This is also a view that has come precisely because of its popularity under withering criticism, particularly by scholars of early modern South Asia. And so I think Sanjay Subramaniam, to whom I refer, would prefer to offer a far more granular account or nuanced account, in which, as I began with my cite of him, where he says that essentially there are different views and different kinds of knowledge about India and in Europe in the 17th century, and there are people who argue and clash bitterly about what the right kind of knowledge about India is. And the example that he presents us with is that of the famed Italian traveler, Niccolò Manuzzi, who is somebody who travels to India and who spends a lot of time criticizing other people's knowledge of India and says, they didn't understand this right, or they didn't make the right kind of painting, and here's the real painting that I would like to present with you, and here's the real history, and so forth, right? So there's a kind of fight between different kinds of European perspectives in South Asia. Then at the same time, we're confronted with a work like this, which is from the early 18th century, many years before Napoleon. And I don't know what to make of it, and I'm curious to hear what you think of this. But when I look at this work, I see it's hard for me to not be teleological, and it's hard for me to not be presentist in turning back to look at this work that was perhaps created in this part of the world, as in the German-speaking lands, maybe not, maybe somewhere in Europe, but is a work that bears a lot of the features of what will go on to become a kind of visible European construction of Asian history later, right? Might be seen as precociously visible. Certainly a certain kind of playing, for instance, with questions of race. And as I've suggested in citing the work of Alexander Bevilacqua, that there is this movement towards racialization that seems to be taking place even in the German-speaking lands in the 17th century. And so the question then becomes precisely what might this kind of object do to that kind of framework? And if I knew more, I might have something to say about that, but I don't. I can only leave this as a puzzle before you.
Okay, thank you so much, Abhishek. Thank you, everyone, joining in.